want to tell you a story, one filled with mystery, conflict, a few twists and turns, love, tragedy, and incredible triumph. Now, every story needs a hero, and this one's loaded with them. But it has a villain as well, one that has already savagely attacked countless children and has affected many more lives along the way, including my own. I want to tell you about a developmental disorder called RETT Syndrome. You may not have heard of RETT Syndrome before now. Many people haven't, but it's highly likely you have encountered a person or a family who's living with it. Also, it's believed that there may be hundreds of thousands of young girls and women worldwide who have RETT Syndrome, but have not yet been identified or have simply been misdiagnosed. But this story isn't just about the villain. It's also about some extraordinary and courageous people who have not let adversity have the final say in their lives. And this story begins at the place where most people say, and they lived happily ever after. For many couples, having children is the realization of a lifelong dream.
Before we got married, Bill and I talked about what we wanted in our lives and what we planned for our children. And we talked about, quote, an empire. And I think for him that meant something financial. But for me, it meant having these perfect kids. Martin was first, and he was a perfectly wonderful, fat little baby boy. 3 years later, Tiffany was born. And then 13 months later, Erica was born.
I remember when we first kissed, it was in San Diego, and that's when we pretty much decided that, let's just go look for rings. I never even really asked her to marry me. I just said, hey, what do you think about going and looking for rings? And she said, sounds like a great idea, so off we went.
When we had Matthew, it was all great. You did the Lamaze and you get into it totally. And by the time we had Cara, it was just kind of like, okay, we'll be ready when time comes.
When I was holding Starla in my arms for the first time, I just felt elated. It was an amazing experience, and for the first time, I got what the concept of childbirth being a miracle was.
When Stacy was born, she looked like a little porcelain doll, and she was our third child and our first little girl, and she developed along normal timelines, really, for everything.
Abigail was really a cute baby and incredibly placid and well-behaved, and she wasn't colicky, she didn't cry through the night, she was just gentle and sweet and beautiful.
Angie was a really good baby, loved looking at pictures. She loved to untie shoes for people. You weren't safe if you had to tie shoes when she was there.
While all these families share a happy beginning, none of them had any hint of the unexpected challenges they would also have in common.
I was suspicious that something might be wrong with Erica because she did seem slower. She did seem just much too passive, much too sweet. Didn't want to cry, and I had to wake her up to feed her, actually, sometimes.
She would just lay there so angelic-like. But yet there was life in her. At the same time, it was somewhat being held back.
She stopped giving us really good eye contact. We noticed that if I would look at her, she'd look away. She just didn't want us looking at her.
The real wake-up call for me was on her first birthday. I decided to have a birthday party for her. And at this party, I saw the other children who were about a year old, and they were literally crawling all over her. And I suddenly looked at her and realized that there were problems here.
We were on a plane trip going to New York to visit my sister, and she had a seizure on the airplane, and I had no idea what it was, and that was the first time we knew that there was something different, something wrong with her.
She no longer fed herself. She no longer used her walker to get around, she just compulsively put her hand in her mouth.
She became dramatically different. She lost a lot of skills. She lost her hand use.
She was regressing, and nobody could tell us what was happening.
The doctor said, you know, Mrs. Hunter, we don't know what's wrong with your daughter. She has the thickest chart for any child her age that we've ever seen, and we're really perplexed by this. But there is one thing that we know. We know that she'll never be normal. And we know that you are probably in the process of trying to find out what's wrong. We think you'll never find out what's wrong. But we think that in the process of doing that, you will ruin your marriage, you will ruin your family, you will ruin your health. And so therefore, you really need to let go and give up. And I drew back and I looked at him and I said, you don't have any children, do you? And he said, no. And I said, I could have guessed. And I said, you know, my head is over there with you because I understand all of that stuff intellectually, but my heart is over here with this child, and giving up is not the right thing to do.
The loss of abilities, the repetitive hand movements, the trembling, the seizures. No one knows how long these mysterious symptoms have been occurring, but they've been noticed in girls and women all around the world. The first mention of them in the medical world came in 1965 in Austria, when a physician named Dr. Andreas RETT noticed two little girls in his waiting room making the same unusual hand-washing movements. Similar observations were made by Dr. Bent Hagberg in Sweden, who in 1983 published the first English-language article about this unique combination of symptoms. Word quickly spread around the world, and for the first time, anxious parents began getting some answers. For Maureen Woodcock, they didn't come until 1986, when her daughter Erica was 18 years old.
One day, I get a phone call from Dr. Vanya Holm from the University of Washington, and she said that she had tracked me down. It had been a few years since she'd seen us. We'd actually given up going to doctors all the time, and said, would you like to know what's wrong with Erica? We have a diagnosis. And of course, I was ecstatic. I said, what is it? And she said, it's called RETT Syndrome. And I thought she meant Tourette's, or I thought she meant RETT Syndrome, where the kids got too much aspirin. And she said, no, RETT, R-E-T-T, and said, would you like to bring her in? Because she's a classic case of RETT Syndrome.
Afternoon. I'm Dr. Percy. How are you doing?
Neurologist Dr. Alan Percy has seen over 500 patients with RETT syndrome since the earliest days of the discovery.
When we first recognized that there was a syndrome called RETT syndrome, we really didn't know how to approach parents with this diagnosis. RETT syndrome has been misdiagnosed in the past, largely because we didn't understand it, and they do fulfill certain characteristics of other disorders, such as cerebral palsy, but more particularly infantile autism, because their communication skills are so poor.
For parents who receive the diagnosis shortly after they begin noticing problems with their daughters, the news can be overwhelming. But for parents who had been living for years without answers, finally learning even the name of the disorder made a world of difference.
Imagine you're your parent, maybe your first child, you have so many hopes and aspirations, and then all of a sudden, the child that you thought was so normal has essentially been ripped away from you.
Shortly after Abigail was diagnosed, I would wake up in the morning and it would suddenly hit me what was going on in my life, and it would seem like a bad dream, and I would hope that it was a bad dream, and then I'd remember it isn't. This is what is happening, and it was just like the end of the world to me. And these people who had become our friends and confidants would say to us, there'll come a time when you'll just accept your daughter for who she is. And it's true, it happens. But at that time, all I could think about was how damaged she was and how damaged our lives were. We've come a long way since then. I mean, now I couldn't imagine my life without her.
Rett syndrome is a neurological disorder that affects girls at an early, critical stage in their body's development. The word syndrome is used to categorize a collection of particular symptoms. For Rett syndrome, the symptoms include a regression of skills leading to a loss of the ability to pick up and hold things, repetitive hand movements, seizures, teeth grinding, curvature of the spine, and breathing difficulties. Some girls have the ability to walk, however, many lose this skill as the disorder progresses. Although shortened life is a possibility, individuals with Rett syndrome have been known to live into their 50s. While girls with Rett syndrome usually lose their ability to talk, they can communicate so much with their expressive eyes and are so full of life. This is why many parents refer to their girls as their silent angels. As the medical community learned more about Rett syndrome, they were able to provide families with information about what they could expect as their daughters grew older. Rett syndrome has 4 main stages, each hitting the families like a devastating wave in slow motion. In the beginning, it is very difficult to detect.
Rett syndrome begins with a normal baby, and in its classic form, Rett syndrome occurs in girls. And the children appear normal and seem to be developing fine for the first 6 to 12 months. Generally, their parents may have some concerns during that early time, but it's nothing that's striking enough that they can get professionals to even pay attention. But sometime about the time when they're a year old, just when they're picking up their Cheerios and starting to say mama and dada, they lose those things and they become disinterested in their environment and they're just not making forward progress.
She stopped making eye contact and she started holding her hand in front of her and she would follow her hand wherever she went. And she became just, we called her a faraway child. She just started making less and less connection with us.
In stage 2, they start losing those skills. So those Cheerios now stay on the tabletop and they're not interested in much of what's going on with their family. They're not playing with toys. They're frequently very unhappy, as if they don't like being robbed of their skills. As they go from that stage 2, which is the regression stage, and it's hard, it may last for a year and the kids are so unhappy. During stage 3, they start developing behaviors that are characteristic of Rett syndrome. And as they transition from 2 to 3, you'll see the onset of those behaviors. And those are the hand-wringing that you'll see many of the kids do. They also may have abnormal respiration or breathing patterns when they're awake. In stage 3, frequently don't sleep well still and may go for days without sleeping. They develop seizures often during stage 3. Then this can last for years.
And then she started wringing her hands and clapping and twisting and pulling and biting them, and that was very scary to watch because we didn't know what was happening to her. And it's like my heart was right there in her hand. That's what she was doing to it.
When stage 4 takes over, the extra movements are lost and they tend to become more immobilized and they become somewhat rigid. And at that time, they become more communicative, as if all of this extra movement is somehow interfered with their ability to let you know what they wanted. And they are better at eye pointing and better at letting you know that they understand what's going on in the room.
Although she cannot speak verbally, but when she looks at you with her eyes, you know that she's talking to you, and it seems like that she looks right through you and knows everything that you have inside of you.
No one knows what's going on inside these girls' minds, how much they understand, what they want to say, what they want us to know.
Rett syndrome is a mystery, and then there are mysteries within the mystery. Why does it only occur in girls? Why are they so normal apparently at first, lose their skills? Why do they develop these unusual movements?
Parents were desperate for answers. Doctors wanted treatments, and researchers around the world wanted to learn its cause. a breakthrough in the understanding of Rett syndrome was about to come from a source no one expected.
Discovery Health Channel explores an easy, innovative, yet controversial process that eliminates your period but still gives you the option to conceive. Your period, your choice. Friday night beginning at 9, exclusively on Discovery Health Channel.
Once it was discovered that thousands of girls around the world were suffering from the neurological disorder called Rett syndrome, the questions only seemed to grow. What causes Rett syndrome? Can it be prevented? Can it be cured? Researchers in the field of genetics began looking for answers, but they needed some clues to narrow down their search. Some of these clues would come from the small town of Union, Washington. Bill and Maureen Woodcock had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. Their second daughter, Erica, was diagnosed with Rett syndrome in her late teens. But it was Maureen's first daughter, Tiffany, who was to provide the biggest surprise. Next to Erica, Tiffany seemed to be a perfectly healthy girl. Although she had some slight learning disabilities growing up, she led a very normal life. Most people just assumed that Tiffany was a little shy. But in 1995, a discovery was made that set the stage for an astonishing chain of events.
It was the most wonderful day when Tiffany got married, because Tiffany had been so shy for so long. I didn't know that she would get married and fall in love and do all these wonderful things. Tiffany phoned me up one day, told me she was going to have a baby, and I thought, oh God, this is wonderful, because finally I get to be a grandma. Tiffany ended up having a little girl, about 6.5 pounds. We named her Paige. She was adorable. Tiffany had been married about 18 months, maybe almost 2 years, and I pick up the phone, and it's Tiffany. And the first thing she does is she asks me, Mom, what was Erica like at 9 months? And I just said, why? What's wrong? Because I hadn't seen Paige for a couple months. And she says, well, she's sitting up, but she's not getting into a sitting position herself, and she's not starting to crawl. And so they're a little concerned, and I told them that Erica had Rett syndrome, and they don't know anything about it, meaning the doctors and the therapists. So what do you know about it? What was Erica like? If he'd shot me or punched me in the stomach, I don't think it could have hurt as much, because that was the worst question I think anyone could have ever asked me.
As Paige developed the familiar symptoms of hand-wringing, tremors, and seizures, it became apparent to Maureen and others that Paige indeed had Rett syndrome. Distraught and desperate for some advice and support, Maureen turned to the community of parents on the internet.
I was so impatient to talk to other grandparents who'd experienced what I was going through of having lightning hit twice, that I just immediately got on the listserv for Rett syndrome and wrote a letter asking to talk to other grandparents. And the answers that came back to me were stunning, not what I expected at all. They kept saying, there aren't any other grandparents. You must be kidding. You can't have a daughter and a granddaughter. I was stunned. I just assumed this must have happened before and that there were other people like me.
At the time, parents had been told by doctors that Rett syndrome only occurred randomly, most likely the result of an abnormal or mutated gene in one of the girl's chromosomes. So how was it possible that Maureen Woodcock had 2 generations of Rett syndrome in her immediate family? It didn't take long for this unexpected news to grab the attention of genetic researchers trying to figure out which gene might be responsible for Rett syndrome. Was this the clue they'd been waiting for?
The most astounding thing, and the thing that changed our lives, was that night I got an email from a lady who was a geneticist out of Stanford at that time. Her name was Dr. Carolyn Shannon, who said she couldn't help but see my email, but would I be interested in helping them do research?
When she first made her post on RETTNet that said that she had a daughter and a granddaughter with Rett syndrome, my hands were shaking as I was writing the email back to her, because particularly a family that's affected in 2 generations can give us the major breaks we need to start localizing the gene.
If Rett syndrome was to be understood, if the girls affected with it were to be helped, it seemed the best opportunities lay in the field of genetics.
In each cell in the body, you have information that forms the blueprint of the plan of how the body develops. This information is encoded in genes, and the genes are sorted together into little packages called chromosomes. The genes aren't sorted by what they do. They're just a random mix of information that's sorted together onto chromosomes, and humans have 46 chromosomes.
The genetic information stored in each human cell controls the body at every stage of growth. So what would happen if a particular instruction wasn't communicated correctly at an early stage of development? At that time, geneticists suspected that the girls who had Rett syndrome had a particular gene, most likely among the thousands of genes on the X chromosome, that had randomly mutated and therefore gave false or confused instructions to the rest of the cells as they matured. If the researchers could discover which gene contained the problem, they believed that they might have a chance at doing something about it. But every cell in the human body contains as many as 50,000 genes. Which gene was it? Where should they begin looking? Maureen's family was asked to participate in the research.
Carolyn asked for blood samples, and being out here in Union, which we don't have a great big center of anything, I got a friend who was a lab technician, and she came down and took samples from 14 family members. And I had it on my dining room table. It had to be FedEx next morning, and I could hardly sleep that night because I kept walking around that huge box of samples thinking, I have the Rett monster, and he's on my dining room table. He's caught, and I'm gonna get that sucker.
Maureen's family was the break the researchers had been waiting for. Now they would have genetic samples from the same family to compare with each other. And by observing which areas on the X chromosome didn't match up, they could more quickly eliminate regions in which they would have to look. When the researchers compared Erica's X chromosome with Paige's, they found them to be very similar. Then, to everyone's astonishment, they discovered that Tiffany's also matched up. It was revealed that Tiffany also had a form of Rett syndrome, but something in her DNA was inhibiting it from being fully expressed. Maureen's family was full of surprises, and there were more to come.
What happened in Maureen's family with an affected aunt and niece and then a transmitting female who is minimally affected is a very, very rare event. If we put those numbers together, it's sort of 1 in 100 million that this would happen.
In other words, Maureen's family was a statistical phenomenon. Recurrence of Rett syndrome within families, whether multi-generational or among siblings, is exceedingly rare, and information from these families allowed the researchers to make tremendous progress toward finding the abnormal gene. There were already theories about where it might be. Boys and girls essentially share the same chromosomes, but with one exception. Boys have an X and a Y, and girls have 2 X's. Since Rett syndrome had only been identified in girls, it was surmised that the elusive gene was somewhere on the X chromosome.
The region that it's in is a very active region for the Human Genome Project because there are a number of disorders that have been mapped into this part of the X chromosome.
But with thousands of genes in the X chromosome, it was nearly impossible to know where to look. If this mutated gene was the proverbial needle in the haystack, then samples from Maureen's family helped the researchers remove nearly a third of the haystack they had to search within. With clues obtained from other families and the work of researchers around the world, by the summer of 1999, finding the gene that caused Rett syndrome felt within reach.
The way we're looking for the gene for Rett syndrome is we're looking specifically at genes that lie in the region of the X chromosome that's been localized. And we take them and look essentially letter by letter to see if we can find a mistake in a copy in one of the girls. Potentially my postdoc is looking at the gene that causes it right now. And she could come in and tell me that in the next piece of gene that one of the children has something that wasn't normal and that this identifies the mutation. But we just need the handle on the first one.
By the fall of 1999, in labs around the world, the search was on for the gene that causes Rett syndrome. At the same time, families waited for answers, and some were making discoveries of their own.
As time went on, I started to realize, well, this is, it's a hand that we were dealt, and instead of looking for the negative or worrying about it, let's feel like what can we do to help Cara experience life?
For me, I decided I can't live two lives. You know, I can't live a life where it's Mark, Matthew, and I going and doing things, and then Cara separate. We were a family, and we were going to be a family.
Some of the ways we bring life to Cara is painting. I'm an artist, so I love to paint. Camping, going out camping and having experiences out in the wilderness. Horseback riding. Swimming is probably the best. One day I was out coaching hockey with Matthew and started thinking about the idea of maybe even bringing her out on the ice and skating with her. She used to go and watch Matthew skate for days and days and days. And I'd just park her and let her watch. And I noticed she would watch all the skaters, all the little girls spinning and figure skating. So one day I just said, this is it, I'm taking her out on the ice. So I took Cara out on the ice and started pushing her around in the wheelchair. And when I first took her out there and started to push her, the cold wind against her face started to get her really excited, and her eyes lit up, started smiling, and she made this, you know, with her mouth, and started breathing in and started clapping. And the more we spun her around, the more she started blabbering, you know, to the wind and just having a good time. It was just really neat to watch her experience that. And if you don't look for those opportunities, if you don't go out and try to experience life and experiment, you're never going to fall upon these little things that you'll learn that can actually help her.
At the present time, our treatment strategies for Rett syndrome are really along the therapeutic lines. We can make certain recommendations in terms of their school program. We recognize that these girls do understand things with their eyes and ears in a way that they can't express to us. We are developing educational strategies that will allow us to unlock the hidden strengths that girls with Rett syndrome have that we're now only beginning to understand.
The girls have proven that they can learn, make friends, interact with others, and let their personality shine.
Waving. Hi, Abigail.
Many girls are currently thriving in traditional school settings and are able to use today's technology to communicate in ways no one ever anticipated. While each family has its own approach to helping their daughters, they all share one common goal: to give their daughters the best life possible.
I wanted to give my daughters everything I didn't have, like the ballet lessons, the tap dance recitals, and things like that. And as this condition of Rett syndrome progresses, you trade those ideas in for how you're going to coordinate therapy and treatment, and hopefully you'll find some therapy and treatment that's fun and enjoyable for them, where it doesn't feel like it's work and it doesn't feel like it's a chore.
The real heroes in all of this are the girls with Rett syndrome, who have the greatest patience of all, because they're the ones who have to wait to be taken care of. They have to wait to be fed until we think they're hungry. They're put to bed when we think they're tired. And they have to live in a world where people don't understand their attempts to communicate. It's not that they're not communicating, it's that we don't understand them.
In the course of our lives, adversity tests all of us in ways we could never imagine or anticipate, and we are formed by the choices we make in dealing with these challenges. For those fighting Rett syndrome, the challenges they've had to face have been extraordinary, and their response is inspirational. For a lot of us, the story might be, once upon a time something bad happened, and, well, we just had to learn to live with it. But for the courageous people dealing with Rett syndrome, they've chosen to take the hero's path. They've made a choice to take action. Some take action by defying the discouragements hurled at them, by creating a positive, proactive life for their families. Others have chosen to take action by informing and unifying a community. And still others have chosen to fight back with the powerful tools of science. And like all great battles, the conflict has been intense, and the outcomes have sometimes been quite surprising.
My mission was to find a cure for Rett syndrome. I had a daughter with classic Rett syndrome. I had a daughter who had Rett syndrome but had turned it off and was mildly affected by it. And now I had a granddaughter. So my focus was finding a cure. Then the story took a different turn. It took a turn that none of us in the world could have anticipated. And that's when Tiffany discovered she was pregnant again, which was a concern. Carolyn had made it very clear that 50% of all girls that she had could get Rett syndrome. But immediately they took a test at 11 weeks and it came back that she was carrying a boy. And there was a huge sigh of relief in the entire world from all the geneticists. Went, whew, a boy. Boys don't get Rett syndrome, we got it made. Because the theory had been as if a boy ever got the single X chromosome of Rett syndrome, that he wouldn't pass more than a few days of conception, that it would be such a devastating disorder that you wouldn't even know you're pregnant probably. Of course, Tiffany's pregnancy went along beautifully. She gained weight, the child's heartbeat was great, the breathing was great, everything was wonderful. And Ari was born right on time and nearly 8 pounds, and we were thrilled. And after delivery, the first thing they did was test him, and he was just adorable. And he passed 9-10 on the APGAR, which is a good testing. He got 1 deduction for not crying. But what the heck, he was a good-natured baby, no big deal. Ari came home, and he still didn't cry. He was very, very passive. And then he didn't want to latch onto the breast, and he wouldn't suck, and he wouldn't suck. And by the 4th day, he was beginning to dehydrate. So I talked Tiffany into making up a little bit of sugar water. She gave him a few sips and screamed that he was not breathing. So I started CPR while they called 911. And the 911 people showed up and they said, this is one very, very sick baby. We don't know what's wrong. And we got transported to the big children's hospital at Tacoma. And as I made that drive by myself, I knew that the worst thing that we could ever conceive of had happened. I didn't need the experts to tell me that Ari had Rett syndrome. Carol and Shannon flew up immediately, and that's when the studies began to work. And they had Ari's blood, and they checked it, and guess what? Ari has the same chromosome that his sister, his mother, and his aunt had. And of course, he only had one of those X's. There was no mitigating, no confusion about the whole thing. And what happened with Ari is, for the next 1 year and 15 days, he never learned to roll over. He couldn't swallow and suck and breathe at the same time. And he was on a G tube, and he had, we don't know what they were, seizures. When Ari finally died and gave up, and he just couldn't go any further, it also told me how tired our girls must get day in and day out. I suddenly realized Ari was about love and communication and about really going after what Rett was all about. He was leaving the biggest clues that any child in the world for this syndrome has ever left because he was a boy.
We thought that we had understood that Rett syndrome was like other X-linked dominant disorders, and that it caused symptoms in females, but that the males would be so severely affected that they didn't survive pregnancy. And Ari taught us differently.
In September of 1999, a surprising turn of events took place, one that would change the Rett syndrome story forever. At the Baylor College of Medicine in Texas, a researcher in the genetics laboratory of Dr. Huda Zogby found something no one had ever noticed before.
I was working on an independent research project, and I asked if I could use a sample from a Rett patient as a control for an experiment I was doing on that other project. When I was using that sample, I made an observation that was completely unexpected. Then I told Ruthie and I told Huda, and I said, you know, this is interesting, shouldn't we look into this more? And so that's what they did.
Dr. Ruthie Amir began running a variety of samples in a mutation detection test. If there was a mutation to be found, it would leave a distinctive extra band on the gels used for the testing. After several rounds of testing and retesting, Ruthie began to see a consistent pattern emerge.
In one of these jail, I just saw 6 patients having this extra band that shouldn't be there.
She found some alterations, but she was sure they're just normal variations or polymorphisms. It wasn't until she sequenced them and found that they are the real mutations that she was confident, and she called me at home and was very excited.
Buddha, I want you to see it. I want you to see it and to tell me that you think it is the gene.
She said, I'm coming straight to your house to show you the data, and she indeed did, and we looked at it, and I was dizzy for a few minutes because, you know, when you work on something for so many years, it's hard to believe it's real, and I thought, something is wrong. I'm sure this is not it. So I said, Ruthie, we need to do this. We need to do more controls. We need to look at more patients.
We screened more patients. We found more mutations. And then we found in one of our families, the RETT families, another mutation.
It was absolutely real, and Dr. Franca's lab similarly did the analysis and found mutations. So this is how we became sure this is indeed the gene that's mutated in RETT syndrome.
Obviously, you are completely thrilled after all it has been found. This is the most important thing. At the point, it doesn't matter who found it, in whose lab was it found, and what is the gene. We've got it.
After years of research from geneticists all around the world, the gene responsible for causing the neurological disorder called RETT syndrome was finally discovered in September of 1999.
Very strange.
After extensive testing to verify the results, the time finally arrived to share the discovery with the rest of the world. Several parents of RETT syndrome children, including Maureen Woodcock, Kathy Hunter, and Claudia Weiss, were invited to join the researchers in Houston for the announcement of the exciting news.
Today I have the extraordinary pleasure of introducing a Baylor College of Medicine physician scientist who is no stranger at all to genetic discoveries.
Thank you, Dr. Feigen, and thank you all for coming. I'm quite excited to tell you about the discovery of the gene that causes RETT syndrome. I saw my first RETT patient back in 1983. In fact, Ashley is here with us today with her parents, Dr. Clifford and Judy Fry, and her sister, Kristen.
It's quite a journey, and of course we still have a journey to go.
First of all, I want to thank the families that contributed to this research.
The gene that Huda Zogby and the researchers were looking for was, in fact, on the tip of the X chromosome. The gene's name is MECP2, short for methyl CpG binding protein 2. The discovery meant that the geneticists could begin a whole new phase of research, and families who'd been living with RETT syndrome had new hope for their girls.
Well, I've always hoped that the discovery would come in time so that it would have consequences for Abigail. It certainly has consequences for RETT families and for genetic research generally. I don't know whether it's too late for her, but without this discovery, the work for finding some kind of genetic intervention couldn't even begin.
To find a gene that's responsible for a disease is always a very important discovery because it is the first step to take in order to understand how the disease comes about and what you can do to treat it.
What's new about the mechanism of disease in RETT syndrome is that we found a mutation in a gene that regulates the expression of many, many other genes. When the brain is developing, there are a variety of genes that are expressed at different times. And this is very much like different musicians playing different notes in a symphony. All the musicians have to play their notes at the correct time so that the music will be harmonious. And the genes similarly in the brain have to be expressed at different times and perform their functions. If some of them have abnormal expression and are not silenced when they should be quiet, we're going to have abnormal gene expression and subsequently neuronal dysfunction.
One of the first positive results of the gene discovery is that there's now a test for families to detect and confirm whether or not their daughter has Rett syndrome.
It doesn't hurt. You don't have
Having a test is absolutely critical to establish the diagnosis with accuracy and hopefully in the future to develop a treatment which is effective. And with that effective treatment, then a screening test which will allow us to make the diagnosis early in life, because by and large this is a sporadic disorder. Does not occur in families for the most part, but does affect the general population in a way that a screening test could be important.
There are still so many questions that remain for the researchers. What causes Rett syndrome? Can it be prevented? Can it be treated? What can be done to help the girls who are currently living with it? The work is far from over.
My windowsill is coated with a line of children with Rett syndrome. And those girls remind me every day why I need to be there, because I would like to help them and their families and future children with Rett syndrome. And it does keep me going.
As the research moves forward, the opportunities for hope continue to emerge, as does the significance of the contribution of Maureen Woodcock's grandson, Ari.
Ari is more important for this step of our research than he was for finding the gene. Because all cells of his body only have the mutant gene. We can use Ari to find the genes that are controlled by MECP2, and that will help us to understand the next steps. The contribution of Maureen and her family to this whole field has been extraordinary. In my view, they are heroes in this story.
Every parent with a Rett syndrome child has a special story. I think we also have something else in common. We all have the same desire to want to care for our daughters, love them, hopefully cure them. That's the same desire we have all around the planet. And it's our job as parents to speak and help our silent angels.
Although the girls currently living with Rett syndrome may not benefit from this new breakthrough for years to come, families, caregivers, and friends continue to discover the special spark in each of these girls and find reasons to celebrate.
When Angia smiles and happy and laughs, it makes everybody's day, not just ours, but everybody's that comes in contact with her.
She's taught me that I can love someone so intensely, and I've probably told Abigail I love her a million times, and she'll never say it back to me, but I know she loves me, and I just love her to death.
There is no feeling sorry for me, and there's no feeling sorry for my daughter, because she's awesome. She loves to do things with us, and I'm moving, man. I'm moving, you know? I'm looking for the next thing.
With each new discovery comes new opportunities. But this fight isn't over yet. We all still have a long way to go. Abigail here is the one who introduced me to Rett syndrome. She reminds me why all of this is so important to tell, and so important for all of us to pass along. As the story continues, it's been really wonderful to see how the growing awareness about Rett syndrome has inspired more and more people to become involved. And following the discovery of the gene, it is our hope that treatment and a cure are finally within reach. Perhaps someday soon, we'll be able to end the threat of Rett syndrome forever, so it becomes a distant memory, and that would be the happiest ending of all.
Learn more about alternative medicine. Connect to discovery.com/health. Now, what drives us to seek pleasure or fall in love? Take a closer look at what makes us who we are on Sex Appeal, next on Discovery Health Channel.